coming in person and also on Zoom. I can't really see you guys, but I think you can all see me. Yeah, so today I will be talking about the research I did for my thesis. And the title of my thesis is Linking Participatory Science Motivations and Data to Advance Biodiversity Monitoring. So even though a lot of you here, at least I know, are definitely familiar with participatory science, citizen science, I thought I would start with just a definition. And this is the one I used in my thesis. So participatory citizen science is an interdisciplinary field in which members of the public partner with scientists to collect, share, and analyze data. And then I threw up some terms on the bottom of the slide there that are kind of used interchangeably with participatory citizen science. It's just something to be aware of. So we have participatory science and citizen science. Those are kind of the ones that I use most because they're kind of just abbreviations. And then also community science, community-based monitoring, participatory monitoring, and participatory action research. And then there's even more beyond that. There's kind of debate as to what to call these types of projects. But today I'll kind of mostly be calling them citizen science. And so this field is actually a pretty big field. There are over 1,000 active projects, and they are all very different from one another, or many of them are. They can vary in their time scale, the number of participants they have, the topic, and then the level of specificity within that topic, and then the geographic and spatial coverage of the project. And so today I'll be mostly talking about biodiversity-oriented projects, but I thought I would give some examples of different citizen science projects just to illustrate the diversity that exists within this field. So the first one is one called Kilonova Catcher. This is an astronomy project, so definitely very different than biodiversity. Participants actually are using their own telescopes, and that is very different than some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. This one is called Spot a Tick and Share. This is an example of a public health project aimed at tracking tick-borne illnesses. This one, Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, they do water quality assessments. So that one's much more hands-on and actually taking samples. The Audubon Christmas Bird Count. This is a large-scale project that happens annually, but for a short period of time, and it's obviously, as the name would suggest, geared at birds. And then eBird and iNaturalist. Corey talked a little bit about iNaturalist. I use both eBird and iNaturalist. And these are biodiversity projects, and they're the main topics of my research. And so, since they're very important to my research, I thought I would go a little bit more in depth about these two projects. So these are both large-scale online citizen science platforms that collect data globally and year-round, so basically at the maximum geographic and temporal scales. And eBird has been collecting data since 2002 in the form of checklist submissions of birds, and that has location included. There are over 930,000 users, and then together there are 1.6 billion observations from these checklists. So definitely a very big project, lots of users, lots of data. Then we have iNaturalist, which has been collecting data since 2008. This collects observations of the where, the what, and the when of any living thing. So it's expanding just beyond birds that we have in eBird to any living thing. There are over 3.5 million users, and together they've generated over 232 million observations. So another important aspect to think about with all of these projects is the way that data is collected. And so here we have this continuum of like opportunistic detection, which is essentially just not planning on collecting data, just collecting it kind of by happenstance, and then controlled detection, which would be very much planned. And so the projects that I'm working with are kind of good examples of falling on in this continuum. So with iNaturalist, this is a good example of an unstructured project where users can submit an observation of anything they find at any time whenever they feel like it. They don't have to be doing any dedicated type of essentially field work. Although you can go out with the intention of using iNaturalist, but commonly that's not necessarily what's going on. Then we have an example of a semi-structured project in eBird, where users still have a lot of flexibility as to when they sample, where they go, how frequently they participate, but there are additional metrics as to how they collected the data. And so we record basically details about the observation methods that we would not have on iNaturalist, which is fully unstructured. And so on eBird, they track how long you were making your list of birds, how far you traveled to make your list of birds, the geographic coordinates, and the path you took to get that list. And then we even have an inference of non-detection, because before you submit your checklist, they say, is this a complete checklist of all the birds you saw? And if you say yes, that's kind of an inference that you didn't detect any other birds throughout the time that you were birding. And then the farthest end of this continuum is structured. That would be something like the water quality projects I mentioned, where people have a very specific protocol as to how they're collecting water samples, and they're likely told exactly where and when to collect that sample. And so, with citizen science being such a big field, a big reason why it's grown is that there are benefits of citizen science. And so, on the one hand, there are benefits that citizen science provides to people. It gives people positive outcomes like social connections, learning, feelings of empowerment. It can improve scientific literacy. It can provide skills for careers in science. Like if someone wanted to be a water quality monitoring person, they could do that in their project, and that's a great skill. It satisfies a desire to contribute to science and conservation as well. And then from a data standpoint, citizen science can provide large data sets that can be used to monitor biodiversity over large areas, and that's something that I'm really interested in for my work. And then it can also be used by other entities like government agencies, and we're seeing that as policy like the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act was enacted in 2017, and eBird and iNaturalist are popping up in environmental impact statements as well. And so my work is kind of building on this, but also looking for other linkages that exist between the people, the data, and the citizen science. And so I do this by I have 2 chapters of my research. And in the first chapter, I look more at the people perspective. And then in the second chapter, I transition over into the data side of it. And so in the first chapter, which is titled Participation Intensity Influences Motivations for Participating in Citizen Science, I'm looking at why people are participating in citizen science. And so, essentially, recruiting and maintaining citizen science participants is essential because it can improve the outcomes of projects. We know that when we can maintain users, especially users who are going to be producing a lot of data, that improves the outcome of the project. And so motivations to participate are diverse, and they can vary according to a lot of factors like demographic factors, psychological perceptions of the benefits that people get by participating, and then personal values. And despite all this diversity, we have seen that contributing to science and conservation is consistently found as a top motivator among participants. And so even though there is kind of a wealth of knowledge on the diversity of motivations and what motivates people to participate, there is still kind of this knowledge gap as to how motivations change throughout the duration of participation. And so previous research has found that contributing to science and conservation is especially important for continued participation, as well as just overall participation. And then it's also found that egoistic motivations are more important initially, and then those shift to be more collectivistic as we continue our participation. However, a lot of these studies are basically asking people for their initial motivations and then their current motivations. But that leaves this space of time in between that initial and that current kind of up in the air. And that's where that's the direction I went in with my research, trying to fill in that gap there. And so I asked the question, how are motivations for using iNaturalist influenced by participation intensity? And so you might notice that I am saying participation intensity, but then on that previous slide, I was kind of talking more about a timeline. And the reason for that is that, ideally, I guess if we wanted to see how motivations changed over time, I would be a PhD student and I would do a longitudinal project for 5 years. But since I'm not a master's student, I found that I can measure participation intensity on iNaturalist with observation count, and that observation count positively correlates with the time since joining the platform. So it's essentially kind of a form of seeing sequential participation over time via this proxy of observation count. And so what I did to see how people's motivations changed across different participation intensities is I made a survey on Qualtrics. I know at least some of you here filled it out. So sorry that you've already done this, but this was a year ago, so you need the refresher. And in that survey, I asked the respondents to rate 15 motivations that are based on previous literature that are motivators for projects on a 5-point Likert style rating. Then I asked them to list or choose up to 3 of their most important initial motivations. Then anything that they rated as very important or extremely important in that first question got returned back to them. And they ranked all of those motivations against each other so that we could kind of parse out among the important motivators, which ones were the most important. And then just some user metrics like observation count and then demographic questions. Then after some piloting, refining the motivations, making sure that the survey was user-friendly, we were ready to distribute it. And we did it in 2 ways, a quota sample and a convenience sample. So when we distributed it with a quota sample, we stratified the users by their observation count. And so we wanted to sample from different pools of observation counts in order to make sure that we were hopefully getting responses from people with different observation counts so we could answer our question of how motivations are different at different participation intensities. And you can see there that we did get responses from every observation count group. We sent a survey request via the direct messaging on the iNaturalist platform, and we sent 700 requests and got 208 responses, which was pretty good. I didn't know people would actually check their iNat DMs, especially like lower users who are either newer or just have less engagement with the platform. And that also kind of helps explain why that greater than 1,000 is the highest response rate, just because those are users who likely have very high engagement with the platform and really like the platform, so they might be more inclined to answer my questions. Then we distributed by a convenience sample where we essentially opened up the survey to any iNaturalist users. This was the flyer we used, and we distributed it on Twitter, university listservs, and then just kind of word of mouth and emails to colleagues. And we created a Spanish version of the survey. My friend Victoria translated it for me, and then we were able to have 2 versions to hopefully broaden who could actually answer the survey, because iNaturalist is actually available in many languages, including Spanish. This ran for 11 weeks, and we got 221 responses. So overall, we got 429 responses, and this is just the breakdown of the observation count groups and then how they responded. And I basically put this up there. We don't really need to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but just to show that we did get responses from people in every single observation count group. And so first we'll look at, well, this is a white screen. Don't worry, you are seeing it correctly. But first we'll look at how people rated the motivation's importance. And I mentioned the 5-point Likert scale. You guys have probably all answered a survey with a Likert scale, but whether you might not have realized it's called a Likert scale. It's basically usually 5 or 7 points, and it's used when there's a difference between the levels that can't really be established numerically. And so in this case, it goes from not at all important all the way through extremely important, and then there's 5 levels total. And so what we're seeing is that for about 2/3 of the motivations, the majority of respondents marked them as very or extremely important. And then for about 1/3 of the motivations, majority of respondents marked them as slightly or not at all important. So those yellow colors were not important, and then the tealish blue was very important. And the key takeaways from this figure are that the most important motivations were improving species knowledge and then discovering information about ecosystems. whereas the least important motivators were advancing my career and gaining recognition. But then I wanted to break it down by participation intensity to see how these differences change. And so what we're looking at here is the 5 participation intensity groups or observation count groups that I had. And then the bars represent the percent of responses in those groups that rated that motivation as either very important or extremely important. And so something to point out, species knowledge and discovery, which were the top 2 motivators, are staying highly important across all 5 groups. So which makes sense considering how important they were when we looked at all of the responses together, but that's just something that's important to know. And then 3 motivations actually grew in importance significantly. Those were science and conservation, personal metrics, and building friendships. Personal metrics and building friendships, although they did grow, are still not highly important for either group, but it's interesting that they grew with that participation intensity. Now, we're looking at the results of that question that asked people to rank their top motivators, the ones that they rated as extremely or very important, against each other. And so this was ranked from 1 to N, because you could have had 10 motivations that you marked as really important, or you could have just had 3. And what we're seeing is that for all observation count groups, species knowledge was marked as the most important of the important motivators, above every other motivation. And then ecosystem discovery was also marked very highly above the rest of the motivators, but below species knowledge. So this is kind of hammering home the importance of those 2 motivations. Then I was able to get an exact observation count on the day that users took the survey. And so I looked for a significant relationship between the Likert ratings for each motivation and the actual numeric observation count instead of that grouping. And what we're seeing, I did put numbers for the Likert ratings. 1 would be not at all important. And what we're seeing here is that there were 6 that had significant relationships. But again, like, it's important to note that recognition, personal metrics, and career remained of low importance, even though they grew. And then science and conservation once again grows, and that increase is predicted by previous research. And so the key takeaways from, I would say the biggest takeaway from this research is that iNaturalist users are highly motivated by improving their species knowledge and discovering information about ecosystems around them, which is kind of a long-winded way of saying learning. Even though learning has certainly been documented as a motivator for participating in projects before, it is interesting because if you kind of can remember all the way back to the beginning slides, I was talking about how we predict that egoistic motivators, which learning is something that's kind of centered in yourself and improving something for yourself, those are expected to decrease in importance. But what we're seeing here is that they are just remaining highly important for every participation level. Then we saw that some motivations changed by participation level. That included science and conservation, which increased in importance, and that is in line with what we found with other projects as well. And then, kind of the so what of all of this. Why do we care? This is interesting because it could have implications for attracting and retaining users. Like, if we want to encourage participation and we know that users are motivated by learning, we can keep that in mind and try to gear strategies for recruitment and maintenance towards learning. And then the question of if this is applicable to other projects comes up. And I don't have necessarily an answer to that, but I would be interested to see if it would be applicable to kind of projects with similar structures like eBird. And since it does in some ways mimic results from previous projects, it could be applicable to other projects as well. And so now hopefully you can see that I looked at that people side, but then once we have people participating and generating data, then the question becomes like, why do we want this data? Like, what can we even do with it? And why is it, worth producing? And so that's what I looked at in my second chapter. So my second chapter is titled Participatory Citizen Science Data Complements Agency Collected Data for Species Inventories. So to shift gears out of this like people headspace into this data headspace, we'll just have a quick introduction. So species monitoring is a critical component of biodiversity research and conservation, but this is comprehensive data collection that can be labor intensive, time consuming, and expensive. And so in Florida, we actually have a state law that mandates that all government owned lands be monitored and managed by government agencies. And so there is kind of this natural question of how can we overcome these constraints when we're trying to do species monitoring. And then I'm interested in looking into citizen science as a way to reduce the burden of these constraints. And so there has been previous work done on the utility of citizen science in species and resource monitoring, and they've kind of had mixed results. And so some research has found that there's limited utility, that citizen science produces similar biases as professional data. So for instance, Lepidoptera is overrepresented amongst insects. Some research has found that citizen science data is only comparable in quality to professional data sometimes. And then there's even some case studies that have found, like one in Pennsylvania, that, for instance, bee biodiversity is better measured by professional data than by iNaturalist data. But then there have also been case studies that have found that citizen science can serve in a complementary role to professional data. And so those case studies have been on frog biodiversity, invasive plant distribution, reef fish biodiversity, avian species richness, invasive mosquito monitoring, and even water quality assessments. And so I wanted to know if citizen science data can be used in conjunction with state agency data to create more complete species inventories in state parks. And so what I did was I looked at 39 state parks in Florida, and you can see there on the map in the middle, that big one is Paynes Prairie. So for my Gainesville people, that's where we're at. And these parks are all managed by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP. And each park has a management plan that has species lists that are updated every decade. And so I chose these parks. They're in FDEP's District 2 of their administrative units. And I chose them because they were updated in 2024. So that it was the most recent data that I could use. And since these are parks, they're open to people, citizen scientists are also collecting data in these parks. So for each park, I made a data set that had a citizen science species list. And so that was an aggregation of research grade iNaturalist observations, and then eBird checklist observations, and then an FDEP species list. That was the list from FDEP for presence only species lists that they use in their management plans. Then I did some taxonomic harmonization because I wanted to be able to directly compare the species from either citizen science or FDEP. And in the FDEP list, there was some taxonomy that was, I guess, kind of out of date because they've been making these lists for a long time. So I didn't want to be double counting species or leaving anything out. And so I did this with a package in R called TaxSize, and then some really fun manual correction. That was fun. And then I had my final data set where I had the species documented by citizen science and the species documented by FDEP in all 39 state parks. So in total, from both sources, we had 5,454 species across these parks. 3,948 were documented by FDEP, and 3,540 were documented by citizen science. So here we're looking at all 39 parks, and we're essentially looking at this metric, which is basically the proportional contribution of FDEP data. And so what we're seeing is in about 75% of the parks, there are more species documented by FDEP. And then in the other 25% of the parks, there's more species documented by citizen science. But when we break down all the species and look at them in groups, we can better see where citizen science is contributing data. And so what we're looking at here is all of the species within different taxonomic categories, and then the proportion of those species that are documented by either FDEP only, both sources, or citizen science only. And hopefully what's jumping out to you is that 40.8% of insect species were only documented by citizen science. So that's a pretty major contribution. 23.3% of bird species were only documented by citizen science. And then 11.8% of plant species were only documented by citizen science. And the plant species result comes even though on average, FDEP was documenting more plants in each park, there was still a lot of novel species only documented by citizen science. However, there is a lot of variation from park to park. So I put 3 examples up there to kind of illustrate how different the different parks could be. And so the first one is Payne's Prairie, which I know all of us Gainesville people are familiar with. We are seeing huge contributions from citizen science. And I like triple checked, and that insect bar is correct. For some reason, the data that I had, they did not have any insects documented. And so this is an example where citizen science is more important than the average in that park. But then we have somewhere like Wakasasa Bay, where we're having very, very minimal contributions from citizen science. And I did look that park up as well. And from what I can tell, a lot of it is only accessible by boat. And I saw something that said, like, if you're going camping there, make sure you check the tides. So it seems like it might be a little bit hard for people to access that park, which kind of would explain partially why, compared to other parks, this park has such a small amount of citizen science data. And then we have San Francisco Hammock Preserve, another Gainesville park. And we're seeing that it almost looks like I just shrunk the big graph down and put it there. It basically is mirroring that overall trend where we have a large contribution to insects and then pretty significant contributions to birds and plants as well. And so to take a bit of a closer look at what's going on or what could be happening in a park like this, I thought we could just look a little bit at San Francisco. So we here have San Francisco, which has a little over 2,000 species. And we can see these are just some examples I pulled out of species that are either documented only by FDEP, by both sources, or by citizen science only. And so there's some plants, there are some examples of insects, and there are some examples of birds. And I guess the key takeaways from this are that it's kind of surprising what is or isn't documented by either source. And it's kind of hammering home that complementary value, that something that I at least am surprised like no one on eBird has documented dark-eyed junco. Kind of makes me want to go out there and find that junco. I know Jackson thinking about it. Or even like an eastern carpenter bee. I mean, I know we were there for City Nature Challenge, like what was that, 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago? And that seems like something we definitely could have documented. And maybe we did. I got this data, a few months ago. But just those surprises there that it's maybe something you wouldn't expect. It's not necessarily really cryptic species or very difficult to find, but both sources are finding different things. And so with all of this difference and variation in the parks and kind of what's going on here, why are some species documented, some species not? I kind of had a secondary research question about what qualities of species or parks impact the proportional contributions of FDEP and citizen science data. And so I first looked at qualities of species by looking at conservation status from the IUCN Red List. There were only 20% of all the park species even had a status from IUCN, probably because there's just so many plants and insects that don't have a status. And so what we're seeing here is that it is interesting that citizen science is providing the only documentation of some of the near threatened, vulnerable, and endangered species. However, none of these categories have that many species. And so, for instance, like vulnerable is only 37 species total. And so that proportion is probably only 3 or 4 species. And so even though this is an interesting result, it's not necessarily a strong enough result to signal a major difference between the contributions of citizen science and FDEP. We can't say that one source is only providing species of one category or another. Then I tested some different park characteristics against the proportional contribution of FDEP data. And so I tested the acreage of the parks, the population of the city the park is located in, the park visitation in fiscal year 2022 to 2023, which is tracked by FDEP, and then the total number of unique citizen science observers in that park, and the total number of citizen science observations. And I found that both the observers and observations had a significant relationship with the proportional contribution of the source. And so here we're looking at the number of unique citizen science observers. And basically what we're seeing is that the proportional contribution of FDEP is decreasing as we increase in the number of observers. So that makes sense, because that also kind of, on the flip side of that coin, the proportional contribution of citizen science is increasing. And so a similar relationship existed with observations. And so basically parks with more observers and observations have an increased value of the citizen science data in the parks. So the key conclusions here from all of this is that citizen science can fill gaps in state agency data in a cost-effective way. All of these data sets are freely available. They're pretty easy to tailor to different geographic areas, and that these data sets are especially consistently providing otherwise undocumented species of insects and birds, and then even some species of conservation concern. And so the reason that this is so interesting is that eBird and iNaturalist are both rapidly growing platforms in their usership and the observations they're generating. And so there's so much potential for increased data from these sources, whereas the constraints that exist on the professional surveying are pretty much going to stay the same, or maybe get worse. And there could also be applications of this beyond Florida. This is 39 state parks in Florida, but eBird and iNaturalist are globally popular. And then, you know, government agencies managing lands is also happening well outside of Florida. And so I would love to research it in other parts of Florida and other parts of the country, but also I definitely think it would be applicable. And so with all of that to take in, hopefully you see that there's this kind of like there's a major duality in citizen science where we have this whole people side because the people are so important for creating the data, but then we also need to know, what do we do with that data? Why is that important? And so I looked at both sides here in my thesis, and I'm kind of able to draw some connections based on what we looked at today and just in general. And so we saw that people connect to citizen science by submitting observations, and we see that they're submitting a lot of insect and bird observations that are important in state parks in Florida. Then citizen science returns benefits that align with motivations to people, and some of those would be learning opportunities, at least with iNaturalist. Then we see that citizen science is contributing large data sets for biodiversity monitoring towards just this having data. And then since I basically show that this data can be used to help manage lands that provide people with recreational opportunities, we're seeing that linkage back to people. And so this whole kind of cycle of people using parks, people documenting data, it's all connected, even though my chapters standing alone definitely seem a little bit random, I guess. And so I think that having this perspective is very important because it allows us to answer kind of more complex questions. And so this is just an example, and there's definitely so many other questions to answer, and my research is not the answer to everything. But an example would be like, how we want to know in general, how can we generate desired data? And so to answer that question, we would need to know what data is the most useful. And so my second chapter basically found that in Florida state parks, insect and bird observations are most useful from citizen science. Then we would need to know, okay, well then who generates that data? And we could definitely do a user analysis because the metrics of users are available from iNaturalist and eBird. And then we would want to know, okay, well, how do we motivate those users to participate and actually make that useful data? And what I found in my first chapter is that learning opportunities motivate people to use iNaturalist. And so all of it is kind of connected and helps to answer those questions. And so as we look to the future, I think that taking these interdisciplinary approaches to both maximize the experience of participants and the utility of data are the way to go. So now I want to thank all of you guys for coming on Zoom and in person, and just acknowledge some people who helped make my thesis possible. So first I'll acknowledge my committee, Corey Callahan, Nia Morales, and Rob Goralnik. They've been an amazing committee, helped me so much and supported me a lot. We see both of my labs up there, Corey's lab, the Global Ecology Research Group. I love you guys. Nia's lab too. Then we have the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And then specifically Scott Groves, who works there. He was really helpful and very forthcoming with their data and just kind of helping me to wrap my head around how all this data was collected and answering any of my questions. I'm really grateful to iNaturalist and eBird for so many things. I mean, first of all, I love using those platforms, so that's just on a personal level. But I'm grateful for they provided me with all of my data, all of the people who used and provided observations. And then even the iNaturalist team helped me when I was developing my survey a little bit. And then I'm of course grateful to all of my friends. So I hopefully have all of your pictures up there mostly. My childhood friends, my undergrad friends, and my Gainesville friends. And then of course my family have been tremendous support, especially my parents. Yeah, and so with that, I'll take any questions. And thank you. Oh, yeah.
To ask this first one
Okay.
out, I guess it's appropriate to chapter 2.
Mhm.
How might your data be biased by if you have a Park Service employee that also are iNaturalist enthusiasts and they're
Yeah.
posting, and how might that be influenced by these not MAGA but mega users? Because when you're showing this, I'm thinking a friend named Rick Owen who goes by Bubba, and he is a iNaturalist junkie. He's posting data images from 20 or 30 years ago because he has field notes and slides, and he's worked for DEP, and he's always out on his time off, going to his public lands and posting on naturals. How does that, how do you reconcile that, or does that have much of an effect?
Yeah, well, so I've actually some people, when I've presented this with people from FWC or FW, they've actually asked me about that. And I think that for the message that I'm trying to send, which is that this data can be used in a complementary way, even if maybe we're seeing that people who work for the agency are documenting on iNaturalist, in the way that I was making my species list, I'm eliminating any redundancy. So either it would be still providing additional species if what people have told me is that sometimes it's easier for them to document on iNaturalist than go through whatever channels they have of documenting through the agency. And so it basically doesn't change my key takeaways or key findings, that if that's an easier way to document that data, then that's great, because then we still have it documented if we're using them together. And so I do think that is really interesting, because I guess I can't account for that, but I don't think it necessarily changes the potential use of the data. And then did you have a second
Part
question?
2, as you mentioned in the first chapter, that species information, do they just want to know, oh, what is this? Upload it and I look. Is that all they're interested in? Or do you think they want to delve deeper in, oh, this is such and such bird or moth, I want to learn more about its biology, and I don't know that iNaturalist allows them to learn. Maybe they go learn on their own. How far does that depth go? Is there just, what is this type of question?
Yeah, so I guess I can't answer that based on my survey, because in my survey the motivation was improving my species knowledge, and then discovering information about ecosystems around me. And so, but I will say that just knowing iNaturalist actually does allow people to learn more about the species. They're especially on the website, but I think now in the new app because they've just recently changed the app and made it more user friendly. You can click on species and it gives you information about their life history, their reproductive habits, their diets, their ecology, their distribution. And so I think that opportunity is available to people. And even before they just changed the app, that's been available on the online platform for a long time. And I know that everyone who answered my survey at least has some interaction with the online platform, because that's where you see your DMs. I still don't even know if that's on the phone app yet, but it certainly wasn't at this survey I did a year ago. So yeah, I think people do have that opportunity to learn more on iNaturalist.
I have another question about your chapter 1,
Mhm.
people side. So have you, because you mentioned you collected some demographic data,
Mhm.
have you looked at how the motivations might be different in maybe age groups, right?
Mhm.
And this will actually help you to develop different strategies to attract different age groups or other demographic background.
Yeah, so that's definitely like something that's interesting, and there's been a little bit of research on that. My survey, majority of users were 45 or under, but we actually got some pretty good stratification of people answering in like all the age groups that we had. That's why the only majority I could give was 45 and under, but that encompassed like 3 or 4 of my age groupings. And then there were still people who, I think that was only like 65%. So there were still people who were over 45 in my grouping. But yeah, I think that would be interesting. And I do wonder if maybe certain ones that are more geared towards like the mobile elements of the app would be more important to younger people. But yeah,
It's just because I do the other type of research looking at the age and looking, it looks like younger audience, maybe if they're in high school, in college, they're more interested in knowledge.
yeah,
But adults or young adults, they're more interested in for fun or
Yeah.
relaxing, right? So you will see although they're all under 40, but they're very different motivations.
yeah, that's definitely true.
The question in the chat.
Oh.
Based on your data, do you think FDEP can turn over their species monitoring program to citizen scientists in easily accessible parks and focus efforts more on less visited parks? And how could your data facilitate this transfer?
I think that a big takeaway from my data is that citizen science is serving in a complementary role. So I don't think the results of my data would support in any park just completely turning it over to citizen science. All of the graphs that we saw, even when there was major contributions from citizen science, there was still a large part of that bar that was either documented by both or by FDEP only. And so I don't think that turning it over to citizen science is a good way forward. I'm more proposing citizen science as just a complement to the data, and it's especially useful in parks where there are a lot of people observing. Potentially you could lessen your surveying in those parks, but I don't think that my data would support that. I just think that the complementary role is really the take home there. Yeah, Erin.
Great job, Sam.
Thanks.
I'm curious if you know about like if and how FDEP effort varies across parks in terms of like why did we see them sampling insects in Queens Parade that their effort is different? Because do you know how their methodology is it from the top down? Do they all do it the same way, or does it vary based on park?
Yeah. So that was when I acknowledged like Scott Gross, because that was something that was really hard for me to wrap my head around. Like, how are they even getting this data? And it was hard for me to wrap my head around because there is no like, in my head, I'm like, well, surely it's in every park we do this, 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 and this, and it's not like that at all. So basically, the way that from what I was told and how I best understand, the